In music, there are 12 notes. We'll talk about that later. But I want to show you 12 photographs I wish I had made. And I want to tell you why I wish I had made them. And in doing so, I hope I can impart some useful information. And I do so much better if I can walk around instead of standing right here. Photography comes to this country on a Friday afternoon, September 20th, 1839. Aboard a steamship sailing into New York Harbor from France come the instructions for the world's first announced photographic process, the daguerreotype. It was a warping chore to make, dangerous, lovely, and completely secretive. There are no instructions, no books, no anything. Henry Fitz, an American, gets the instructions more or less and has a little camera fabricated. And being an American, he decides, since he doesn't know what he's doing, to make a self-portrait. Exposures at that point are, well, we shorten them very quickly, less than 60 seconds, but close to 60 seconds. Never having done this or seen this before, he's, being practical, decides, has a brace behind his head, knowing he can't keep his eyes open for that long, shuts them, makes an exposure, and if you overexpose, give too much light to a daguerreotype, they turn that gorgeous blue. Gorgeous blue. And it was a complete misnomer from the beginning that black and white photography is black and white. It's never really black and white until today. Anyway, I show that to you, and I wish I had made it because in my world, which is the art world, not the birding world, that looks so completely contemporary to what you see today. That looks so much like what you see on museum and gallery walls around the world. It's just bigger. Very much like that. Not about the specificity and the sharpness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I like it because it was almost like a prayer. He didn't know what he was doing. The Countess Castiglione, about 12 years later. Very famous photograph made in Paris. She was a highly intelligent woman, immigrated from Italy, now in Paris, the lover of a number of men of great power and intellect. And she's of great power and intellect. And a Parisian photographer makes hundreds of photographs of her. Great beauty, very intelligent beauty. You can see the brace behind her head. In subsequent images you normally see of the reproduction of this, they've taken that out. But I wish I'd have made that photograph because our mantra today, at least in the art world, is photographs are not just about making pretty, pretty pictures, but most of us would agree with that. Photographs and photography practiced at a high level is about issues, exploring something, gender, process, geography, your own memory, love, all kinds of things. And I wish I'd have made it because it's about so many things. If I had a student, which I do on occasion, deconstruct that and write a paper, you know, I'd say, well, it's about fashion, it's about issues, it's about simple beauty, it's about hair, it's about jewelry. It's about the history of photography because what she's holding is what I call a jewel case that you found on all the old daguerreotypes. I wish I'd have made that. My man, Eugene Auger, self-taught. Took me a long time to understand this, but he wrote a whole new language in photography using a huge camera, primitive at the time. The lens doesn't cover it, so you get the vignetting on the edges, which you see a lot of art photographers replicating today. But he was also, well, his project and his theme, and my mantra is if you want to get better, pick a project and give yourself a year or 2 years and elevate some pictures. Make 40, make 60, make something that revolves around something. His project, which he carried on for a little over 40 years, was his beloved Paris was changing. It was becoming too modern for him. And his project was to go day in and day out up every alley, every street, photograph doorways, photograph everything. Berenice Abbott, who was Man Ray's assistant, loved the old man. When he died, she gets his glass plates, brings them to New York, and subsequently the Museum of Modern Art acquires them and publishes a 5-series volume of Auger's work. They're not pretty pictures, never were meant to be. But what I love is he's also a commercial photographer, which I assume some of you are. He tried to make his living by selling some of these historical pictures of changing Paris. And every single one of the contemporary colleagues or competitors he had would go around to the front of Notre Dame and photograph it straight on. No frills, no changes, no nothing, buddy. He was genetically indisposed to do that. He goes across the Seine, bisects Notre Dame with a black tree, uses an oblique angle. It ain't straight on. It's a little off to the side, a little tilted. Every effing picture he does is like this, over and over and over. I think it's magnificent. And the more I look at it, and I've looked at it now for close to 40 years, I just think it's magnificent. Atmospheric, intriguing. It ain't pretty. But again, it's like a prayer to me. Wish I'd have made that. And you don't need me, homie here, to tell you how beautiful she is. An anonymous medical photograph from the 1940s here in America. And the point here is, I tell myself this all the time because I do portraits as well as everything else I can get in front of my camera, is never, ever, ever underestimate the power that ordinary people carry with them. Anybody in this room, I could make a portrait of any one of you. And if it's done right, it would be extraordinary. Not because of me, but because of how you look, what you carry with you. She also has what I call the look. And you didn't see those cheesy smiles that we get all today, you know, self-conscious smiles. People who'd never been photographed looked like they were looking into time itself. They just stared at the camera. They have what I call the look. I love that look personally. Cheesy doesn't go very far, but it works in magazines and on blogs. But it doesn't stand the test of time too much. Now stay with me here. Wendy Ewald gets out of graduate school some years back, goes to the Appalachian region of Kentucky, and starts a project that's followed her around, much like Robert Frank's book, The Americans, has followed him around. Her project was to give children in a 2-room schoolhouse point-and-shoot cameras. Children that had never been 50 miles from their house, that lived in places called Kingdom Come Creek, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she won a MacArthur Genius Grant some years back for this project that she subsequently went around the world to do. And here was the project. She took these little children, ages 6 to 11, and she says, I want you to go out and photograph what you know. And I'm going to talk more about that later. Photograph what you know. Photograph your family. Photograph your pets. Photograph yourself. Photograph anything you know. And that got them going. They photographed landscapes that looked like seed pod covers or seed catalog covers in the hardware store. They photographed their dogs. They photographed their mothers and fathers. But then she said, and I want you to photograph your dreams. Well, you tell a 6-year-old kid or a 10-year-old kid that's not as sophisticated as you, or me for that matter, to go photograph a dream, and you give them a point-and-shoot camera, all bets are off. You don't know what they're going to come back. You guys, I can look at some of your faces and have a pretty good idea what you're going to come back with. But them, nah, you don't know. This is called, I dreamed I killed my best friend Ricky Dixon. And here's the gig. They were buddies. They had a falling out over a pocket knife. One of them thought he got the wrong end of the deal. And they quit speaking, and they made up 4 or 5 days later. And one of them said, you know, I dreamed I killed you. And the other one says, well, let's go make a picture for Wendy. And here's the deal. Stay with me here. What in the heck made those kids go to a tree with a V in the worst light possible, and dappled light, what have you? What made him close his eyes and throw his arms out Christ-like? What made him do that? It's a rhetorical question. I don't know what made him do that. But I was mistakenly imported to talk to a convention of psychologists once, and I showed them 10 pictures, and this was one of them, and they freaked out over this when I posed that question. And they came up with all kinds of things, you know, memory, et cetera, spiritual inclinations, vaginas. It came up, all kinds of stuff came up. And I'm thinking, I don't think so. I don't think so. But I wish I'd have made it, because it's a ballsy picture, it's not safe, and it's powerful in its own way. In my opinion, Robert Frank, most of you, I hope, know who he is. Spent a long time in your beautiful, interesting city. Did The Americans, a book with the Guggenheim grant. And then he gets rich and famous. And then he gets divorced. And then things happen. His daughter Andrea is killed in a plane crash over Tikal, the Guatemalan ruin. His son Paulo is diagnosed with a form of mental illness, schizophrenia. And he moves to Nova Scotia. He's divorced. It's cold. It's Robert Frank. He takes 2 Polaroids. He scratches them. It's visceral. He takes mirrors and he writes nasty, sick of goodbyes. It drips. And if you deconstruct it, he uses what I call archetypal shapes and things. Mirrors, replicas, conical triangles, little Day of the Dead toy, scratches all over the negative. That may not resonate with you, but when I saw that years ago at Museum of Modern Art on one of my trips up here, I had to go sit down. Doesn't mean you would, but I could feel it. I could just feel it. I wish I'd have made that. Joseph Kudelka, the Czech documentarian, who's famous for photographing gypsies, who's also famous for saying, traveling the world, sleeping in people's living rooms, and et cetera, et cetera. And he said, I have this rage to see. Rage to see. That's good. I wish I'd have made that. It's a pure documentary photograph, but if you deconstruct that, and if you see the contact sheet, he did 5 frames. The gypsy is down on his knees talking to the horse. Man and animal, classic animal. And in every single frame except the last one, the horse's head is up. Plus, the gypsy's not gesturing. And in the very last frame, he's doing that, and the horse ducks his head. That changes everything. That just changes everything, visually and psychologically. No horizon line. He's famous for tilting his horizon line, breaking the frame, but no horizon line there. Also, I tell students this all the time, but it falls on deaf ears. Aside from the gesture, which is hugely important as opposed to staticness, you got what I call an archetypal shape. You got a horse, number one. That's an archetypal thing. But you got this shape of that fedora that's popular now. It'd be different without that hat, too. I love to deconstruct photographs that I'm fond of and think, how does that work like that? Why does it work like that? I like this guy, contemporary photographer's work. This is some of his earlier work, because photography as practiced today, and certainly for the last 15 years, as we said earlier, or I said earlier, it's not so much about making pretty pictures, at least in the world I dwell in. It's about issues. You're going to explore some sort of issue. Well, his issue was, and continues to be to some extent, he's alone in a post-apocalyptic world where we have poisoned the earth. And he's trying to repopulate and save the earth and heal the environment with tools of his own making, which are completely inadequate. And he uses himself in all his photographs, and he builds the wings, and he builds all kinds of things. They're phantasmagorical. They're allegorical. They're like faux biblical. They're strange. And then he's got artistic skills, comes out of an art school, Kansas City, and he will airbrush on them, and he prints them big. He does them in color now, but they weren't about perfection. They were about, as a metaphor, our lives and imperfection and trying to repropagate. I wish I'd have made this. This is a Russian St. Petersburg photographer, Alexei Titarenko. It's a straight documentary photograph. You know, there ain't no secrets in documentary photographs. You photograph something you see, and you try not to change too much of it. But what he did and does, and has made a career out of it, is go out in the worst weather in his beloved Dostoevsky city of St. Petersburg, when it's cold, raining, snowing, what have you, and put his Hasselblad on a tripod and walks around and takes anonymous crowds, puts his camera down, and makes a 20-second exposure. Something static, an old woman reading a letter, sitting in the wet pavement in Russia, not staged. And the world moves around her. It's pure photography. Tain't no Photoshop shenanigans there. Just pure photography. The raw materials of your medium are time. All photographs are small parcels of time. Light. Photography comes from the Greek. It means writing with light, drawing with light. Time, light, and for me, a subtle, pervasive sense of memory sometimes. Sometimes. So I wish I'd have made that. James Fee, contemporary photographer, died a few years ago from California, came to your wonderful city, makes anonymous photographs. This would be a BS photograph if it was just straight. Just a BS photograph. Beautiful, continuous tone, et cetera, et cetera. But he took a chance and used all kinds of trashy chemicals on the back of the emulsion of the negative. And he bleached it, and he did all kinds of things. Ruined a lot of them. But it changed everything. And what he was reinvestigating was the history of photography, how some of those old daguerreotypes looked, et cetera, et cetera. And it just changed the scale, it changed the tonalities. It was all wrong. And some of you it'll resonate with, and some of you it won't. I think it's great because it's ballsy. And then this little punk, JR from France, I was up here, I guess, 3-4 months ago, and I saw a film with he and Agnes Devarda, the great French filmmaker. They'd done a picture, done a film together, a documentary. But JR was a skateboarding punk in Paris. And he says he found a camera in the metro, the subway, and he started taking photographs of his friends. And then he's, being a subversive skateboarding punk, he started pasting photographs of his friends on alley walls in parts of Paris. And pretty soon, they got bigger and bigger. Cheap paper, cheap wheat paste. And pretty soon, people were coming to look at him. He was starting to photograph everybody, every anonymous person he could find, and making pictures. And then he reads photographies about issues. Then he reads, in Rio de Janeiro, there's 5 favelas. They circle the city. They look down upon the city where the gentry live. And they had the most murders. One of them had the most murders of any favela or slum in the world at that point, mostly from drug-oriented things. So what he does is fly there. This is before he's rich and famous. And he can't get cab drivers to take him up there. So he has, he walks up there and he asks the gentry, the drug dealers, he'd like to photograph the mothers of kids who had died. He just wanted to photograph their eyes, and he wanted to put them up. And they told him no. And so he came up the next day, came up 3 days in a row. And finally, they said, well, go ahead and do some. So basically what he's done here, long story short, is he got the community to help him. On the cheapest paper possible, he made photographs of mothers, of their faces. And they took wheat paste, and the whole community pasted them on all the facades. What's more, they pasted them on all the roofs. So all the airlines flying in and out would see this installation, is basically what it was, of anonymous people. And it just changed everything. And when I saw that, I just wanted to go throw my camera away. I thought, that's what it ought to be. We ought to make people care. Not how clever we are, but we ought to make people care. That's just my thought. He's gone around the world subsequently. Wild, richly famous, richly deserved. Involves community and photographs every man. Okay, so I think this is the last one of this. I wish I'd have made this, because this guy, this English fella named Justin Quinnell in southern England, takes a quart or liter beer can about 15 years ago, takes a 4x5 sheet of RC printing paper, that's black and white plastic printing paper for the darkroom, puts it in there, tapes it up, punches a hole in one end, makes what's called a pinhole camera. Some of you know what that is. Primitive photography, the beginning of photography. And then he duct tapes it to a telephone pole pointed at that bridge and leaves it there for 6 months in all kinds of weather. And what you're looking at here, he took it out. It's become a big thing, what he does now. He took it out, and he didn't know what he was doing, but he married it to contemporary technology. He took out that piece of paper, and in a, not necessarily a dark room, but in a subdued light room, he scanned it right away. And then he tweaked the colors a little bit, and then he reversed it, And what you're seeing here is a pinhole camera of 6 months of the sun rising and setting. And along the way, his father had died. And he got some scientists to figure out which of the arcs was the day. So in the summer, the sun was rising high, and in the winter, it was rising low. Time, light, and memory. It ain't sharp. It's a wonderful picture. Wish I'd have made it. So, in music, and some of you play music, there are 12 notes. If you play the piano, and you hit a C, you go up each note, D flat, D, you go all the way back up to C. So you can make the argument that every melody that you cherish in Western music is made with the same 12 notes. That's my half-baked theory, okay? But the part I like is if you play the blues, that's the pentatonic scale. That's only 5 notes. B.B. King, Eric Clapton, all those kind of guys, they're basically working with 5 notes. So here's the deal. Let's equate it to photography. You got 12 notes. What kind of melody you want to play? Which notes do you use? What key you going to play in? You're going to make it dissonant? You're going to make it classical? You're going to make it pop? You're going to make it what? And what are those notes? Well, here's my half-baked theory. Note number 1 is your subject matter. Birds, water, portraits. What do you find interesting in the world? Not me. What do you find interesting? The world doesn't need me. The world needs what you're doing. And the full weight and mystery of your art of photography rests upon your relationship to your subject matter. What is your subject matter? If you don't define that, you kind of spin your wheels. And you can live your life happily spinning your wheels, but it's worth thinking about. Note number 2, well, here's a couple examples. Wilson Bentley, a farmer by trade in the Midwest on your left, spent 40 years photographing snowflakes. Bachelor farmer, Norwegian bachelor farmer. So I thought, I'm kind of jealous. I thought, that's pretty cool. Wouldn't that be great to look forward to every single winter because you knew what you were going to do? You're going to photograph snowflakes. My man Eugene Auger photographed his beloved Paris street by street for 40 years. That's a project. Note number 2, light. The French cinematic world have a wonderful kind of term. This is really bad Texas French, entre chien et loup. And basically it refers to light, where the light is neither dog nor wolf. Between dog or wolf is the translation. So he's talking about right before the sun comes up, right after the sun comes up, right before it comes up, down, right after it goes down. It's a hybrid of light. It's not dog or wolf, a metaphor. But point is, in Homie's world, it's all good. Spotty, diffused, sharp, soft, foggy. I like it all. I like it all. So, how do you use it? Are you an engineer and there's a one way to do this? Or I like it this way, I'm doing it this way? Are you a little more democratic in your approach? I don't know. How do you play it? It's a major note. Ansel Adams, you know that photograph, or you should. Moonrise over Hernandez. Gorgeous, gorgeous light. All about light. But in contemporary society, all bets are off. In this gorgeous, magnificent city, it's a cacophony of light. Nighttime or daytime. The frame itself. The world doesn't have a frame, but photography does. And it's photography that taught us to see what happens on the edges. Somebody's hand sticking in, somebody's leg sticking out, etc., etc. How do you play it? How do you use the edges? In a graphic manner? In a classic manner? But they change pictures. And you never saw pictures that looked anything like that on the edges in painting until the invention of photography 179 years ago. Think about it. The edges. Franking, as from Robert Frank, franking the edges. That means to me tilting the horizon line a little bit. Big and contemporary photographer. Lee Freelander, Gary Winogrand, you know, taken from snapshots. You know what the original meaning of snapshot is or was? Snapshot is a 19th century English hunting term. It meant a rapidly fired bang shot at a hurriedly moving target. Snapshots. So we appropriate it, and we generally appropriate it with thinking about amateurs. But contemporary photographers use that tilt as well as an oblique angle all the time. Sometimes they don't even know they're doing it. But you can look at a number of people's work. Sometimes it's just a little perspective shift, and sometimes it's a huge perspective shift. My opinion, a little goes a long way. Dr. Seuss, I'm a fan of the angle, Suessing the angle. It's an elegant note. It's more subtle. Oblique angle, I talked about this last night. If I stand right in front of you, that's straight on. No perspective changes. If I move to the side a little bit and tilt my camera a little bit, that's an oblique angle. Eugene Auger, that changes everything, but in a very subtle way. It breaks the frame, it breaks the space. I personally use it all the time. It's not something you really notice that much, but it's pretty cool. Julie Blackman on the left, she's not only used an oblique angle, she's tilted the horizon line using her $55,000 Hasselblad digital camera. Bad girl, bad, bad girl. You get the idea. Depth of field, most of you know that. You know, f/22, sharpness. f/1.2, only one thing is sharp. So how much do you want in focus? And this morning I looked at a bunch of people's portfolios, and you just see over and over so many people in love with sharpness. It's culturally desirable. It makes a lot of sense. But that's not how the eye sees. We see in short depth of field. So, point being, you might want to try. If you're a f/22 person, you might want to try every now and then shorter depth of field or change the focus. But it's a huge note to play. One of the 10 most expensive photographs ever sold at auction by the German photographer Andreas Gursky on the left of the Rhine River, f/45 with a digital back on a view camera, excruciatingly boring photograph. Went for I don't know how much money, but it's as big as a billboard, and that's the de jour. It's a huge, successful photograph, but it's the German aesthetic. Sally Mann, old lens, wide open, no depth of field. It ain't whether it's right or wrong, it's how do you want to use it. Short, long, what kind of picture do you want to make? Your subject matter. Use of motion, it's natural to the medium. It's as natural as sharpness, but most of us are culturally inclined towards sharpness. I saw a lot of sharpness today. But look, in the history of photography, the first photograph we know of a man or a human being showing up in those long exposures is on a Parisian street, and there's a fella in the front here getting his boots shined. And the rest of this street is teeming with people. But they've all disappeared because the exposure is so long. Everybody with me so far? But the one person, or the two people, are the ones in the front, guy getting his boots shined, and both of them are out of focus. That's the history. Shows up all the time. That's the guy I showed you a minute ago, Alexei Titarenko. He told, I saw him here in New York a couple years ago, and he told me that was about a minute exposure. And he didn't know what he was doing. He said, I didn't know what I was going to get. I love that. I don't know what I'm going to get. People getting on the Russian subway to go home after work. Okay, symbolism. Use of metaphor, symbols, is from the history of art. They can be humbling and dissonant, but they change how we view particular images. Sometimes you don't even think about them, but the symbols work on you in some way. Symbols, and then the materials. Cameras. Boy, do you have a cornucopia of cameras out there. It's pretty wonderful. But I mean, what kind of material you want to work with? You want to do wet plate collodion, ether, alcohol, and gun cotton on tin or metal or glass? An antiquarian, you want to use the new Fuji or the Hasselblad medium format digital? And what kind of camera feels right to you? It's your instrument of choice. It's like a sable paintbrush for a painter. Or you pick your art. I like something that feels right, and they don't all feel the same. I don't want to have to think about it when I'm working. Same with guitars. They don't all sound the same. And then we have binocular vision. It's because both eyes see separately that gives us a sense of depth. And nobody can really explain that yet. But I always liked what Gary Winogrand said. It took me years to figure it out, but he said, well, I photograph to see what things look like photographed. That's true. And haven't you had the experience when you look at a picture and you think, wow, it didn't quite look that way when I did it. Or it looks better, or it looks worse. Take a chance. Take a chance. You're contemporary people using a contemporary medium, if you wish to. There are all kinds of ways to make pictures. Vantage point, that's a huge note. High, low, to the side. What do you want to do? It's photography that taught us to look at things from a different perspective. Bird's eye, underneath. It was photography. You didn't see that in painting so much. Because we could. And then context. The pictures you make, the portfolios you make, what's the context you're going to show them? People this morning and yesterday bring me iPads and show me their pictures. That's a context. Other people put them in installations like JR. That's a context. They go on a museum wall in a frame, flat. You paste them all together. That's context. How do you want them to look? Which is why we all ought to go to museums every which way. If I lived in your city, I would so go to the Met every single Sunday. I would so do that. And I know that's not an original idea, but my God, talk about context. How do you want to hang them? Flat on a wall? From strings? What do you want to do? I'm not asking you to do it. I'm asking you to think about it. And I put this up last night. And so if you were there, you can ignore it. And if you weren't there, I always liked this. A student sent it. I used to have a student who moved to San Francisco, and he wrote me that this Nobel Prize physicist was coming to talk to their company. And he sent me what he had said. He summed up his career by saying, this is what I've learned. And I thought, that's a great metaphor for photography, what we do. You want to start something good or do a project? Look in an unexplored region of your landscape. Up here, not physically so much. Failure? Well, hell, that happens to everybody. But it might be an invitation to try something new. Subtle, unexplained things that happen in your photographs, don't overthink them and don't dismiss them. Understand how your equipment works, or at least the parts that you use. And sometimes you want to back off a little bit from working. Sometimes. And take a look, get a different perspective. And every time you make a picture, a good picture, you ask a question of nature in the broad sense. You have to listen to what she tells you and ask her other questions. Sometimes things lead to other things. But in my experience, if you start projects, you're interested in evolving your work, it just generally doesn't happen while you're sitting there like St. Paul on the road to Damascus quietly and waiting to be struck by light from God. It happens when you're working. It happens while you're making pictures. It happens when you see this didn't work and what could I do to fix it? That's how it happens. So, I'm pretty much through. Yeah, baby, 8 minutes. So, looky here. This is rhetorical, but if I had more time with you, I'd say get out a piece of paper or get out your notes in your phone and answer this. So it's rhetorical right now. What do you find interesting in the world? People, animals, landscape, water, sex? What do you find? Gender? Write a definition of photography for yourself. How do you define it? What are you good at? What do you know? Physics? Motherhood? What do you know? What are you no good at? What do you need to work on? What do you want to do? What are you hoping to accomplish? Please your camera club? Get in the Met? MoMA? What's keeping you from making better work? You lazy bums? No time, no money? When do you feel most alive? Go photograph that. Who's your audience? Camera club? Therein, I'm done. Thank you.